This past weekend, an emergency was declared in Texas. As very severe winter weather slams the United States, Texas seems to be getting hit with the worst of it. Right now, around 5 million people are without electricity, which is scary because most people in Texas use electricity to heat their homes. At least the news is reporting. I don't live in Texas, so I'll take their word for it. But a lot of people are wondering, why did the power go out? And this is where everything gets political. The Green New Deal is back in the press, not because of this story, but in the past week, we've heard about Joe Biden warming up to these ideas. We had a major story from 60 Minutes with Bill Gates talking about the global effort to fight climate change. And now we're learning one of the main reasons that power is out in Texas. Wind turbines are frozen solid. Now, wind, as they report, accounts for about 20% of Texas's electrical supply. And with the turbines being frozen solid, well, the electrical supply is being strained. The Texas independent electrical grid can't handle the massive demand, and thus there have now been rolling blackouts. On the right, we're seeing people say, this will come to your neighborhood next. Tucker Carlson running a segment saying, this is essentially what the people fighting climate change will bring to you. Many on the left have countered, saying gas pipelines are being frozen too. It's an absurd argument. The reality is, I don't think it's fair to use Texas as an example of green energy catastrophe, but there is still reason to look. Let me stop. I'm an environmentalist. I love the idea of renewable energy, but you have to recognize wind only works if there's wind. Solar only works if there's sun. And of course, coal power plants and natural gas only work when they have fuel, but those fuels can be readily available year round. In winter, when it's very cloudy and when it's cold, well, wind and solar may not be all that efficient, which is, well, it presents a very serious risk to places like Texas if they are not properly winterizing their electrical grid. Maybe it's true Texas shouldn't rely so heavily on renewables, but it really does put us between a rock and a hard place. We can't just rely on fossil fuels forever. I'm not saying ban it outright, but we do need alternative forms of energy, which brings me to my biggest complaint with all of it. As many on the right are saying, you see, the Green New Deal, that's what they're going to do. And they're saying we need fossil fuels. We need the oil industry. And it's a fair point. I understand. And the left says the gas lines are frozen too. It's also a great point. Y'all, why don't you build nuclear power plants? These can operate in. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm already seeing the tweets. But then we'll end up like Chernobyl and Fukushima. No, we just build them better. We build new generation nuclear power. It solves everything. Nuclear power is one of these renewables, and it is reliable. And that's the problem with politics. First of all, the Green New Deal is not even about green infrastructure. If it was, they'd be building nuclear power plants. Instead, as Saikat Chakrabarti, AOC's former chief of staff, said, it's about changing the economy. This is what I cannot stand about partisan politics. But let's read the story, because the first thing I want to point out is, look, I'm frustrated with all the stupidity and the absurdity, but I hope everyone is okay. I hope you are safe. For those that are weathering this storm, you seriously need to make sure you're taking care of yourselves. And I always tell everybody, you've got to prepare for the worst. You hope for the best, you prepare for the worst. I don't normally do this, but I give a shout out to Safe and Ready Meals when we're dealing with these kinds of issues. So go to safeandreadymeals.com and you can get emergency food supplies. I know that many of these, leftist, tribalist people like to rag on me for shouting out these emergency food containers. But look at this. You have these bins, 4-week emergency food supply, 2-week emergency food supply, and you can get this at safeandreadymeals.com. They do a discount when you go to, this URL. I'm shouting this out because I genuinely believe this is a smart thing to do. And I've long been confused why it is that sometimes it rains. Sometimes you have serious inclement weather, shutting down the roads, shutting down the power. What are you doing to take care of yourself in the event that a flood hits? It's annoying to me when they talk about this is some kind of prepper thing. People see it as like, oh, you're a prepper. Prepper for what? The rain, a tornado, an earthquake? What? These things happen all the time. We have literally hurricane season. You have a first aid kit, but do you have some water stored and do you have some food stored? All right. That's why I shout out Safe and Ready Meals. Please take this seriously. I genuinely want people to be safe and secure and prepared, not for the apocalypse, for the snowstorm that might come. So full disclosure, this is a sponsor. They totally help out the channel, but I only really ever shout them out because I genuinely mean it. I've got a bunch of this stuff myself. I've eaten it. I think it's fantastic. I don't know if it would exactly save you in the event you don't have electricity. Maybe you should also have some backup batteries as well. I have these really cool things I got off the internet. They're these big battery packs. You plug them in and they provide you with I think it's 4 hours of full electricity. Like you could plug in an air conditioner to it. Well, I don't know how long an air conditioner would work, nor I don't think you'd want to use one of those right now, but a hot plate at the very least, and you can cook with it. Just don't let people shame you or embarrass you into not taking care of yourself. All right, now let's get into the nitty gritty. First, I want to talk about what's going on because I want you to know the severity of the weather. At least 9 dead and 5 million without power as Winter Storm Uri sweeps the nation. Wind turbines freeze. Wind chills of -20 in Texas and killer tornado hits North Carolina. They say, well, I want to focus particularly on Texas. They say 2 people have died in Texas from suspected cold exposure, including a 78-year-old man who fell in his front lawn and a 60-year-old homeless man in Houston who refused shelter and was later found dead at an overpass. The youngest of the victims was in Tennessee, so we have this weather is really hitting everybody hard. President Joe Biden declared an emergency in Texas on Sunday night to pledge federal aid to the state. Georgia and Florida, several homes and buildings were damaged, and at least 4 people were injured following a series of tornadoes that touched down throughout Monday afternoon. Let me say something real quick, okay? Because to all the, I see all these lefties talking about severe weather coming because of climate change. I'm right there with you. Let's talk about renewables. Let's light up those, let's figuratively light up those nuclear power plants. Make sure they're done properly. Thorium salt reactors, I hear, are really, really great. I'm not a nuclear physicist. I can't tell you exactly what we should do, but it certainly seems like it makes the most sense, right? You want to tell people, you want to mock them. This is what I can't stand. People mocking the fact that I shout out the safe and ready meals are the same people, typically, who are telling you that severe weather is coming because of climate change. Y'all should be the ones shouting this out and complaining about these politicians who are buying beachfront property and flying in private jets and telling us we are the ones who have to sacrifice. Now, look, the reality is we do have to sacrifice. I'm sick and tired of so many people, particularly in big cities, that are the embodiment of the 7 deadly sins. I'm not religious or anything like that. I'm just saying, these people are prideful, arrogant, and gluttonous. All right. It's about time we got people to take responsibility for themselves. Roll up your sleeves, chop some lumber, start a fire, keep yourself warm, figure out how you get food, and stop just assuming everyone's going to do it for you. I'm not saying anything bad about the people in these storms. These people are being negatively impacted, and we will come together to help them. I certainly hope so. But check this out. Over in Texas, frozen wind turbines hamper power output, state's electrical grid operator says. This is where we are getting this major political fight with the left saying, it's not true. The gas pipelines were shut down. The electrical grid itself was frozen. And many on the right saying, if you need a helicopter to spray, what are they spraying? Propylene glycol onto these wind turbines. That's petroleum-based technology and fossil fuel flight to get your wind turbine working. You got a serious problem. Here's the reality. The weather has nothing to do with it. Well, mostly. Texas wasn't prepared for these freezing temperatures because why would it happen? They're not going to invest in the technologies they need to weatherize wind turbines when they're in Texas. But sometimes it happens. So right now, it's not just the wind power being shuttered. I mean, solar is basically shuttered, but I don't think solar is that big of, a large portion of the Texas electrical grid. Wind is. It's about 20%. My understanding is about a fifth, right? Right now, they say that wind is supposed to be producing around 12,000 megawatts of their capacity, which is a total of 25,000. Although those West Texas turbines don't typically spin to their full generation, they are saying that the wind turbines in the South and the Gulf, where it's not freezing or not frozen, is picking up the slack because the winds are generating more power. Here's the issue. Like I mentioned, Texas doesn't plan for winterization with freezing turbines. And so what's the real culprit here is just, we had this massive polar vortex or wind or whatever come down. Texas was not prepared. But we need to be real about a fact when it comes to these, what some are calling unreliable energies. renewable, conservatives calling them unreliable, is that it's not unfair to say wind and solar are unreliable. I wake up in the morning and it's been cloudy every day for the past several weeks. There's barely any sun. Finally, now the sun is breaking through the clouds. And I've been talking about setting up solar, and therein lies the problem. What do we do in winter? Well, you have the possibility, you have the options, out in the middle of nowhere of a gas generator. You get a massive tank of propane, or you get a solar generator. And as much as solar sounds awesome, the energy return on energy invested typically doesn't make sense. Installing the solar is extremely expensive. Buying the system is expensive. And the amount of energy you get, well, you don't actually break even on the amount of fossil fuels energy going into it for years. I think solar is fantastic. I think wind is fantastic. But we have to balance it. Isn't it? Is that simple? The truth is always closer to the middle. We don't want to go 100% wind. That would be insane, because then this would happen. And then what? What do you do when there's no wind? What do you do if you go 100% solar and there's no solar? No, we want to diversify. We should have the ability to produce enough electricity in inclement weather with fuels stored. But we should rely as much as possible on greener, renewable energies. So when we have the wind, we use the wind. And when we have no wind or no sun, and when it's freezing, we kick on those coal power plants and the natural gas power plants, and we work, and it works. The reality here is just nobody expected this. Nobody expected these freezing temperatures. Well, Texas is getting hit pretty hard. We have this from poweroutage.us showing that there's about 4.4 million outages in Texas. All right, so this is serious. I hope everybody is okay. I hope people are finding a way to stay warm. And it looks like, in the northern part of Texas, they do have a lot of power, but getting further south, it's getting particularly bad. This is what's crazy to me. This is from February 7th. Massachusetts climate official proposes targeting regular people who heat their homes. We have to break your will. All right, well, I'm sure there's some context here to a certain degree, but there's this push for Americans to accept a lack of comfort. It was only, 100 and something years ago when air conditioning was invented, I guess. People used to just live in the heat and live in the cold. Get a fire going on the fireplace to keep warm in the winter, to keep your house heated. And in the summer, well, go down to the swimming hole, I suppose. This is what we're going to end up seeing. A deep green freeze, writes the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. Power shortages show the folly of eliminating natural gas and coal. I think the Wall Street Journal has one of the best takes on this, because I've seen a lot of people blame, Green New Deal, that's the problem, and the left saying it's not true. Let me tell you something. First, did you know that there are wind turbines in Antarctica? The Ross Island wind farm, they built a wind farm to generate renewable energy. There's something you need to understand about Antarctica, too. And the reason why the wind farm works down there and it's not working in Texas. I've seen some leftists say, if they can build wind turbines in Antarctica, then clearly the problem isn't renewable energy. Antarctica is extremely dry. It's a desert, meaning there's not going to be ice forming on the wind turbines to shut them down. That being said, they are built to function in Antarctica. In Texas, they aren't. So they're not winterized properly, and no one really thought this was going to happen. Here's what we see from Tucker Carlson. The great Texas climate catastrophe is heading your way. Green energy means a less reliable power grid. Why do our leaders deny that? He's right. Tucker is right. If we rely, actually, let me slow down. If we're talking about, say, tidal energy. You ever see those tidal generators? When the tide comes in, it spins turbines. It's pretty cool. So we could do hydroelectric. That seems to be more reliable. But wind and solar can be particularly unreliable. If we incorporate too much of that into our grid, we'll be in trouble. But nuclear energy, that's fairly reliable. I think hydroelectric is also fairly reliable. We just need to diversify and not rely too heavily on one source of power. Tucker says, the Green New Deal has come, believe it or not, to the state of Texas. How's it working out so far? Well, the good news is that all that alternative energy seems to have had a remarkable effect on the climate. Sunday night, parts of Texas got the temperatures that we typically see in Alaska. In fact, they were the same as they were in Alaska. Wow. So global warming is no longer a pressing concern in Houston. I got to stop there. This is, I can't stand, when AOC heard the tornado sirens going off in DC. This is a big story. There was, because a tornado warning happened. So the sirens go off, and then she tweeted something like, tornado sirens in DC. Oh, it's climate change. And then everybody went, ugh. AOC clearly doesn't understand the difference between weather and climate. Okay? I'm not a climatologist. I can't give you the good academic definition, but the simple version is sometimes it rains, and the climate is like the overall system itself. So when you hear this from conservatives that global warming is not a concern because now it's really cold in Texas, what people in what they're really saying with climate change is that we're going to see a major shift in climate patterns. Now, of course, you have the global warming proponents specifically saying with the temperatures increasing, we're going to see wild weather and oceans rising. Sure, fine, whatever. Climate change means there could be a disruption in the flow of water in the North Atlantic Current, like we saw in that one movie, The Day After Tomorrow. Or it could mean we're going to see more extreme weather events as weather patterns change. And, well, we've built our cities to withstand certain temperatures and certain weather that is fairly consistent. If it's true that this is actually, what's happening in Texas is a part of climate change, you've got a problem. Texas needs to start preparing for wild weather, be it too hot, too cold. Or maybe it's just an anomaly. That's the serious challenge. We have no control Earth. So when you're doing like a science experiment, you have one that stays the same and one changes. So you can see you have a control group. We don't have that for the planet. So to the best of our abilities, we're trying to make sure we just don't pollute too much. I think that makes sense. Whether or not you want to argue about climate change, I do think it'd be silly to assume that within the past 100 or so years, with billions of people emerging on this planet, to think that we're not having a serious impact that could tip the scales, I just think that's wrong. I look at a lot of the science. I think we got to make sure we're being better. More importantly, we had Jack Murphy on the IRL podcast talking about all of this stuff. And I mentioned the Great Reset, right? They basically want people living more sustainably and not owning things because consumerism just produces too much. And I think as much, a lot of people got mad at me when I said this, but I was like, think about this for a second. The Great Reset from the standpoint of this global authoritarian communist type system, horrifying. The woke cult nonsense, really creepy. Bill Gates, also a creepy guy. But I got to tell you, man, there are city-dwelling, gluttonous, arrogant morons. I'm not trying to be overly negative, but come on, they exist. And there are a lot of people that, this is why I've praised Jordan Peterson, because he got a bunch of young men who weren't doing anything with their lives to find the heaviest thing they can carry and carry it. What does that mean? I'll tell you what. Stop relying on a minimum wage job to pay your electric bill and go out in the back, chop some wood, and get a stove in your home. I know you can't do that in cities for the most part. Get away from these cities. While the Great Reset itself, being what they're basically doing is horrifying, there's an element of it where we get people back to just doing some good old hard work, taking responsibility for themselves. That's a good thing. We don't need to be burning all of this fossil fuel if people were actually sustaining themselves. If people lived in ways like they had fireplaces, this wouldn't be as big of an issue. This is what's absolutely crazy to me. Now, what's happening in Texas is the result of an overdependence on society and the system and a lack of personal responsibility. I'm not blaming any of the people who are without power. I'm just saying we have slowly built this system where people are like, I no longer need to get wood to heat my home. Well, we don't want to chop down all our forests. That I get. But we do still need fuel. Maybe get a coal burning stove and you heat your home with fire like we used to. Some people still have fireplaces. I don't think a lot of people in Texas will have a fireplace. But we need to recognize that so long as we are overly reliant on a centralized system, this will happen. Now, here's what Tucker says. The ironically named Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which oversees the grid, had no solution. They simply told people to stop using so much power to keep warm. So in Houston, hundreds of shivering Texans headed to the convention center like refugees to keep from freezing to death. Some Texans almost certainly did freeze to death. Later this week, we'll likely learn just how many people were killed as they tried to keep warm with jury-rigged heaters and barbecues and car exhaust. Yikes. That happens every time when the power goes out. Even advanced societies become primitive and dangerous, and people die. We've seen it happen repeatedly in California for years now, rolling blackouts in a purportedly first world state that is slipping steadily into chaos. But who saw this coming in Texas? If there's one thing you would think Texas would be able to do, it's keep the lights on. Most electricity comes from natural gas, and Texas produces more of that than any other place on the continent. There are huge natural gas deposits all over the state. Running out of energy in Texas is like starving to death at the grocery store. You can only do it on purpose, and Texas did. Rather than celebrate and benefit from their state's vast natural resource, politicians took the fashionable route and became recklessly reliant on so-called alternative energy, meaning windmills. 15 years ago, there were virtually no wind farms. Last year, roughly a quarter of all electricity generated in the state comes from wind. Local politicians were pleased by this. They bragged about it like there was something virtuous about destroying the landscape and degrading the power grid. Just last week, Republican Governor Greg Abbott proudly accepted something called the Wind Leadership Award, given with gratitude by Tri Global Energy, a company getting rich from green energy. I'm not an expert on it. My understanding is that natural gas is fairly clean. I believe it burns clean. So we can use natural gas. Why don't we? Why push against it? Now, look, I'm not going to play a stupid game of advocating for archaic forms of energy. I think we need, fusion tech? We need nuclear energy. But clearly we have a problem when you are not prepared and you lunge headfirst into a more unreliable energy source. It's not the weather, okay? The problem with wind and solar is storage, and if there's no wind or solar energy. Right now, it's getting highlighted because of the cold weather. The problem here isn't wind, all right, Tucker? The problem is Texas is not prepared for this very serious snowstorm, which nobody thought was going to happen and is extremely rare when it does. The bigger challenge we have to ask ourselves is, to what degree can we spend money to prepare for things like this when they are rare? Should Texas have a reserve in the event something like this happens? Have all of these things bought and paid for in the event there's inclement weather? I think the answer is yes. This is why I was shouting out the food company. It may be expensive. Yeah, well, you need to pay for it. Otherwise, people die. We need to have something we probably never use. I bought some of this emergency food. I put it in a cabinet, and it's just basically sitting in storage. That's the point. I don't blame Texas for not being prepared for inclement weather. I'm not going to blame wind energy because it snowed and it was really wet and the turbines froze. I think that's a silly argument. I also think it's unfair when the left doesn't recognize we do not have the capacity to store the energy. We don't have massive batteries to maintain a current when there's no wind and no sun. All right. And that's the big challenge. I think everyone needs to recognize we need green energy. We need these renewables, and we need them in large quantities, and we need fossil fuels. Here's the big problem. You hear it from Greta Thunberg. They want to get rid of fossil fuels in the short term. They don't want to wait until 2030. That's what Greta Thunberg said. They don't want to wait until 2022. They want it now. You know what that means? Millions will die. Millions, tens of millions will freeze, will starve. We cannot do it. I don't have the solutions. Sometimes there are hard questions. But I think the Green New Deal is a scam. Let me just show you this. AOC, Saket Chakrabarty says the Green New Deal is not about climate change. It's about changing the economy. He says, we think of it, how do you change the economy thing? He said it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. The Green New Deal is a scam. It's not about a Green New Deal. It's about a New Deal. That's fine if you want to call it that, but they attached green to it to manipulate our emotions. Not a fan. We need balance. And honestly, we need new technology. We'll need batteries. We'll need fusion ignition. That would be fantastic. For the time being, relying on a wind turbine to just be indefinitely spinning to create that current, I think it's silly. So we need to plan ahead for when a quarter of your energy is shut down by frozen turbines. If Texas is going to send up helicopters to spray antifreeze onto these turbines, I've seen a lot of people say, if you're using fossil fuel, petrochemicals and fossil fuels to actually get your turbines working again, maybe you should just rely on fossil fuels and maybe you got a problem. It's a one-time thing. These storms don't happen all the time. So let's be real. The turbines are great. They work when they work. But we need balance, and we can't have this 100% wind zealotry like some places have done. That's silly. It's silly. But we do need new technology. I hope everybody is staying safe, out there. I hope y'all make it through, and hope everybody's okay. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. over at youtube.com/Timcast, a different channel from this one. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all then.